The crystal condensation on the water glass was the only thing keeping Seraya's hands from shaking when the restaurant doors slammed open. She didn't need to turn around to recognize the source of the sudden, suffocating silence that swept through the room. She knew that heavy, erratic stride, the sound of a man who believed the world owed him an audience. Darius. He didn't just walk toward the table. He invaded it, shoving past the staff like he was swatting away a fly. 8 months of restraining orders and changed phone numbers felt like tissue paper as he loomed over her, his face twisted in a familiar, jagged rage. "You think a silk dress makes you too good for me, Seraya?" His voice didn't just carry. It felt like a physical weight, pinning her to the chair while her body locked up in a reflexive, practiced fear. Across from her, Park Ji-Seon didn't flinch. He didn't reach for his phone or call for security. He just sat there, his dark, impenetrable eyes tracking Darius's every frantic movement with a chilling, clinical detachment. Then came the violation. Darius grabbed the bottle of Cabernet from the ice bucket. "Since you like expensive things so much, have a drink on me." The world turned red. The wine was cold, a shocking contrast to the heat of the humiliation as it drenched Seraya's hair and soaked into her coral v-neck. It felt like blood, hot and heavy, dripping onto the white tablecloth while the entire restaurant gasped in a collective, horrified beat. She waited for the shout. She waited for the explosion. But Park Ji-Seon simply stood. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. With a slow, terrifyingly deliberate motion, he reached for his left cuff, then his right, rolling the fine silk back to reveal the dark, intricate ink of a dragon coiling up his forearm. The room held its breath. Seraya realized then that while she had spent months running from a bully, she was currently sitting across from a king. If you're watching this wondering what happened when that man rolled up his sleeve, hit that like button and subscribe because what came next changed everything. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. I want to know who's riding through this story with me. The wine dripping from her hair felt like a slow, rhythmic ticking of a clock, each drop a reminder of the life Seraya Quinn had tried so desperately to bury. As the restaurant stayed frozen in that brittle silence, her mind retreated, pulling away from the red-stained tablecloth and the dragon-inked man before her, spiraling back into the gray, suffocating months she had barely survived. For Seraya, the past wasn't a memory. It was a physical weight, a phantom limb that throbbed whenever the air grew too still. She remembered the night she had finally left Darius Vane, the way she hadn't even packed a bag, just grabbed her keys and ran into the rain because the look in his eyes had shifted from angry to final. She had spent 8 months looking over her shoulder, jumping at the sound of slamming car doors and unfamiliar footsteps in the parking garage of her apartment complex. To the world, she was a woman who had moved on, but inside, she was a city under siege, always waiting for the next breach in her defenses. Darius had a way of making the world feel small, like he was the only person who truly saw her, while simultaneously making her feel like she didn't exist at all unless she was reflecting his image. Every time she had tried to involve the authorities, the response had been a frustrating loop of paperwork, and call us if he actually does something. The restraining order she carried in her purse was supposed to be a shield, but as she sat there drenched in Cabernet, it felt like nothing more than a scrap of paper that had failed to keep the monster at bay. She had been a ghost in her own life, changing her phone number and her commute, involving HR at work only when his presence in the lobby became too frequent to ignore. This date with Park Ji-Seon was supposed to be the first step out of the shadows. Her grandmother had been the one to insist, her voice rising with that stubborn maternal certainty that Seraya needed someone different. "He's a businessman, Seraya," her grandmother had promised, "and he understands the value of a quiet life." Seraya had spent 2 hours in front of the mirror that evening, carefully applying her makeup to hide the faint, lingering fatigue in her eyes, choosing the coral dress because it felt like a declaration of war against her own fear. But the skepticism had been there from the moment she stepped into the restaurant. Ji-Seon was too polished, too calm, his presence too heavy for a man who simply dealt in import and export. He moved with a controlled grace that made her feel like she was sitting across from a predator who had chosen, for the moment, to be polite. She had spent the first 30 minutes of the dinner waiting for the other shoe to drop, her appetite gone. As she watched the way, the restaurant staff moved around Ji-Seon with a hushed, almost reverent caution. He had asked her about her dreams of launching her own consulting firm, listening with a focus that made her feel seen in a way that wasn't possessive, yet he remained a cipher. He hadn't filled the silences with empty talk or boastful stories. He had simply occupied the space with a terrifyingly still authority. Part of her had wanted to get up and leave before the first course arrived, her intuition screaming that a man this powerful didn't just end up on a blind date by accident. But another part of her, the part that was tired of being afraid, had been drawn to the safety his silence seemed to offer. Now, as the wine soaked through her dress and the humiliation burned hotter than the liquid was cold, her skepticism curdled into a bitter realization. She had brought her chaos into his world, and for a fleeting second, she expected him to be disgusted. She expected him to stand up and walk away, to leave her to the mercy of Darius's spiraling madness. Instead, she watched him roll his sleeves with the precision of a man preparing for a ritual. The ink on his skin, the dark, swirling dragon that seemed to pulse under the golden light of the chandelier, told a story that her grandmother had conveniently left out of the introduction. Darius was still panting, his chest heaving with the exertion of his own rage, unaware that the air in the room had changed. He was still looking at Seraya, savoring the way she flinched, the way the wine dripped onto her skin like an accusation. He didn't see the way Ji-Seon's eyes had gone flat, losing the last vestige of social politeness to reveal something ancient and lethal underneath. Seraya felt a new kind of fear rising, one that didn't make her want to run, but made her want to watch. For months, she had been a victim of Darius's undisciplined, loud violence. Now she was witnessing the birth of something much more dangerous, discipline. The weight of her past felt lighter for a split second, crushed by the sheer gravity of the man standing up beside her. She had been skeptical of the polished Mr. Park, but as he moved around the table, she realized the polish was just a thin veneer over a foundation of iron. Her life was about to change, not because she had escaped her past, but because her past had just collided with a future that wouldn't allow it to exist. The restaurant, once a sanctuary of soft jazz and clinking crystal, had become a tomb of absolute silence. Seraya sat paralyzed, the cold wine on her skin feeling like leaden weights, while Darius stood over her, a sneer of triumph etched into his face. He looked around the room, basking in the shock he'd caused, oblivious to the fact that the predator in the room had finally decided to stand. Park Ji-Seon didn't shout. He didn't demand that Darius leave or call for the manager. Instead, he moved with a controlled, predatory grace that made the air in the room feel suddenly heavy, as if the oxygen were being sucked out by his very presence. Ji-Seon came around the table, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes never leaving Darius's face. Darius turned his aggression toward the man in the expensive suit, his chest puffed out, a mocking laugh bubbling in his throat. "Who the hell are you supposed to be? Her new bodyguard?" Darius barked, but the bravado wavered for a fraction of a second when he noticed Ji-Seon's expression. It wasn't anger. It was a terrifying, clinical detachment, the look of a man about to remove a minor stain from a piece of fine silk. Without a single word, Ji-Seon reached out. His hand, pale and steady, shot forward with the speed of a striking viper. He didn't punch, he gripped. His fingers closed around Darius's wrist, the one still shaking from the exertion of throwing the wine, and squeezed. Seraya heard it then, a sickening, sharp crack that echoed through the vaulted ceiling of the dining room. Darius's eyes went wide, his mouth opening in a silent gasp of shock before a guttural howl of pain finally tore from his throat. Seraya watched, her heart hammering against her ribs as Darius was forced to his knees. Ji-Seon didn't look down at him. He looked through him, his grip on the shattered wrist never loosening. The violence was so quiet, so efficient, that it felt more like a surgical procedure than a fight. Darius tried to swing his other fist, a desperate, clumsy arc of rage, but Ji-Seon simply shifted his weight. He caught the second fist midair, twisting it with a nonchalance that made Seraya's own stomach churn with a mix of fear and a dark, forbidden relief. As if summoned by the sound of the first bone breaking, the shadows at the edge of the room began to move. Two men in perfectly tailored dark suits appeared from the periphery, their presence so sudden and seamless that they might have been part of the architecture until that very moment. They didn't look like restaurant security. They moved with a lethal, synchronized purpose that spoke of years of shared history in darker places. The restaurant manager, who had been hovering near the kitchen with a look of frantic indecision, suddenly went deathly pale and took 3 steps back, bowing his head in a gesture of absolute submission. Even the actual security guards of the establishment froze mid-step, their eyes fixed on Ji-Seon with a recognition that bordered on terror. Ji-Seon finally spoke, his voice a low, terrifyingly calm vibration that seemed to settle in the marrow of Seraya's bones. "Remove him," he said, not even glancing at the 2 men who had flanked the struggling, sobbing Darius. "Ensure he understands that this city is no longer large enough to hold both his presence and hers." The men in black moved in with a terrifying efficiency. They didn't struggle with Darius. They hauled him upright as if he were made of straw, their grips ironclad and undeniable. Darius tried to scream one last threat, his face a mask of agony and disbelief, but a single, sharp look from Ji-Seon silenced him more effectively than any gag could have. They dragged him toward the rear exit, away from the prying eyes of the other patrons, who were only just beginning to find their breath again. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer the silence of a victim's fear, but the silence of an audience that had just witnessed a king deliver a sentence. Ji-Seon didn't immediately turn to Seraya. He stood for a moment, adjusting the cuff he had just rolled up, smoothing the fine fabric back over his tattooed forearm with meticulous care. When he finally turned to her, the lethal edge in his eyes had softened into something careful, almost protective. He reached for a linen napkin, dipping it into the ice bucket, and began to gently wipe a streak of wine from her shoulder. His touch was impossibly steady for a man who had just broken another human being. Seraya looked at his hands, the same hands that had been a wall between her and her nightmare, and felt a new, cold realization dawning. Darius was gone, but the man standing before her was far more dangerous than her ex could ever hope to be. The law had failed to keep her safe for 8 months, but in less than 60 seconds, Park Ji-Seon had rewritten the rules of her world. She was shaking, her whole body betraying the adrenaline crash, but when Ji-Seon's hand covered hers on the table, she didn't pull away. The warmth of his palm felt like an anchor in a rising tide. She was terrified of the efficiency she had just witnessed, but for the first time in nearly a year, the phantom weight of Darius's shadow felt like it was finally beginning to lift, replaced by the heavy, gilded protection of a man whose silence was a weapon all its own. The golden light of the restaurant's chandeliers seemed to dim as Ji-Seon led Seraya toward a waiting black sedan, his hand a steady, grounding presence against the small of her back. The night air was crisp, but it did little to cool the stinging heat on Seraya's skin, where the wine had dried into a sticky, crimson mask. As the car pulled away from the curb, the city lights blurred into long, neon streaks, a stark contrast to the heavy, window-tinted silence of the vehicle's interior. Seraya sat stiffly, her eyes fixed on Ji-Seon's profile. He had rolled his sleeves back down, but the image of the dark, coiling ink she had glimpsed earlier burned in her mind like a brand. She realized with a jolt of clarity that she knew nothing about this man her grandmother had championed. The businessman who had just systematically dismantled a man twice his size without breaking a sweat was a fiction. She felt the weight of the jade bracelet he had tucked into her hand before they left, a gift he said represented protection, and wondered if it was actually a shackle. "You're wondering about the ink," Ji-Seon said, his voice cutting through the silence with a quiet gravity that made Seraya's heart skip. He didn't look at her. He kept his gaze on the passing cityscape, but he slowly unbuttoned his cuff once more. He pushed the fabric up, exposing the intricate, swirling dragon that climbed from his wrist to well past his elbow. In the dim light of the car, the scales of the dragon seemed to move, a masterpiece of shadow and needlework that felt ancient and predatory. "My grandfather wore this mark when he first came to this city," he began, his tone devoid of pride, sounding more like a man reciting a heavy, inherited history. "In our world, the dragon isn't just art, it's a ledger. It represents territorial control, protection services, and the things that exist in the shadows where the law refuses to go." Seraya felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wine-soaked dress clinging to her frame. She had spent 8 months begging the police for help, filing restraining orders that Darius treated like invitations, and involving HR departments that could only offer sympathetic shrugs. She had wanted a protector, someone to stand between her and the chaos of her past. But as she looked at the dragon on Ji-Seon's arm, she realized she hadn't just found a shield. She had invited a shark into the water to deal with a scavenger. "Territory," she whispered, the word feeling like glass in her throat as she recalled the snippets of conversation she'd overheard from his men earlier. "Protection fees. You're not just a businessman, Ji-Seon. You're a part of something that operates outside every rule I've ever lived by." Ji-Seon finally turned to face her, his dark eyes searching hers with an intensity that demanded she look back. "The rules you lived by didn't stop him from putting his hands on your throat tonight, Seraya." His voice was soft, but the truth in it hit harder than a physical blow. "The rules you lived by let a man like Darius Vane hunt you for 8 months. My world has different rules. We don't wait for permission to be safe. We take it." Seraya pulled her gaze away, looking down at her trembling hands. The realization was a terrifying paradox. For the first time in nearly a year, she felt genuinely safe, but that safety came from a man whose very existence was built on the threat of violence. She had traded a loud, undisciplined bully for a silent, disciplined predator. Darius was a fire, wild, destructive, and exhausting. Ji-Seon was the deep ocean, calm, vast, and capable of crushing anything that dared to disturb his peace. "Why me?" she asked, her voice small against the hum of the car's engine. "Why would a man like you spend his time defending a woman he barely knows?" Ji-Seon reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from her cheek, waiting for her to nod before he touched the skin where the bruise was already beginning to bloom. "Your grandmother didn't ask me to meet you because you were weak, Seraya. She asked because she knew you were strong enough to survive a man like Darius, but that you shouldn't have to do it alone." He paused, his thumb brushing a stray tear from the corner of her eye. "I saw the way you stood your ground tonight before I ever got up. I didn't save you because I thought you couldn't save yourself. I saved you because you shouldn't have to break your own spirit just to stay alive." The car slowed as it entered the iron-wrought gates of a sprawling estate, the fortress that Ji-Seon called home. As the engine cut out, the silence returned. But this time, it was a silence Seraya chose to enter. She looked at the dragon on his arm one last time, recognizing that the secret in the ink wasn't just about danger. It was about a commitment that was absolute and terrifyingly permanent. She had invited a predator into her life, and as she stepped out of the car and looked up at the looming walls of the park estate, she knew there was no going back to the woman she used to be. She had traded the chaos of the streets for the order of the underground. And for the first time, the weight of the past didn't feel like it was going to pull her under. The fragile peace Seraya had felt within the walls of the park estate shattered 3 days later with the shrill, frantic ringing of her phone. It was Sunday morning, the kind of quiet day that usually offered a reprieve from the world, but the caller ID showed her mother's number, and the vibration felt like a warning. When she answered, her mother's voice was high and brittle, a jagged edge of panic cutting through the line. Darius hadn't come for Seraya. He had gone for the people she loved most. He had shown up at her parents' home, violating the restraining order with a brazenness that suggested he no longer cared about the consequences. He had smashed the windows of her father's car and left a note taped to the front door, a jagged, handwritten promise that Seraya was still his property and that anyone standing in his way was a target. Seraya sat on the edge of the guest bed in Ji-Seon's house, her knees pulled to her chest as she listened to her father take the phone. His voice was quieter than her mother's, but it carried a heavy, helpless weight. He told her the police had come, taken a report, and left with a sympathetic shrug, citing a lack of physical evidence that Darius was the one who had swung the tire iron. The system was a machine of paper and ink, and Darius was a ghost that slipped through its gears. "He's handled, you said," her father murmured, and the disappointment in his tone felt like a slap. Seraya realized with a sickening jolt that her attempt to protect them by staying away had only made them more vulnerable. To Darius, her family was just a set of levers he could pull to force her back into his orbit. An hour later, a text message arrived from an unknown number. It was a photo of her younger brother, Ji-Seon, walking out of his university library, unaware that he was being watched through a telephoto lens. Below the image, a single sentence appeared. Rich friends can't be everywhere at once. The air in the room grew cold, the sophisticated luxury of the park estate suddenly feeling like a gilded cage that kept her safe while her world burned outside. Darius wasn't just stalking her anymore, he was hunting her heritage. She spent the next hour packing the length of the room, her thumb hovering over the call button for the police, then the lawyer, then her brother. But she knew what they would say. They would tell her to stay calm, to document the threats, to wait for the legal process to move its slow, indifferent limbs. But Darius wasn't a legal problem, he was a violent one. He was a man who had lost his job and his dignity at that restaurant, and he was pouring all of his remaining life force into a desperate, destructive fire. Finally, Seraya stopped packing. She looked at the jade bracelet on her wrist, the stone cool and steady against her skin. She remembered what her grandmother had said, that after the police failed to keep her safe, she needed someone who operated differently, someone who understood that the world didn't always play fair. She realized that her hesitation to fully accept Ji-Seon's help was a luxury she could no longer afford. If she wanted her family to breathe again, she had to stop being a victim and start being an ally to a power that Darius actually feared. She dialed Ji-Seon's private number, her hands shaking as the call connected on the first ring. "Darius is at my parents' house," she said, her voice coming out sharper and more determined than she had ever heard it. "He sent me a photo of my brother. He's threatening them because he can't get to me." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a silence so absolute it felt like the world had stopped turning. Then, Ji-Seon's voice came through, a low, terrifyingly calm vibration that immediately stilled the frantic beating of her heart. "Where are you right now?" "In the guest wing," she replied. "Stay there, I'm coming to you," he commanded. When Ji-Seon arrived 20 minutes later, he wasn't alone. Two of his senior men, including the silent protector Minjun, stood behind him like shadows given form. Ji-Seon took her phone, his eyes narrowing as he studied the photo of her brother and the text from Darius. He didn't look angry, he looked focused, like a mathematician solving a problem that was beneath him but required his attention. "He's planning an escalation," Ji-Seon said, handing the phone back to her. "Men like him don't de-escalate when they lose their status. They get more desperate. They target the things you value because they believe your value is tied to theirs." "The police won't do anything until someone gets hurt," Seraya whispered, looking up at him. Ji-Seon stepped closer, his presence a wall of expensive cedar and ironclad control. "I am not the police, Seraya. I do not wait for the injury to justify the cure." He looked at her directly, his gaze challenging her to accept the reality of the situation. "I can upgrade your family's security today. I can have men at your brother's campus before he leaves his next class. I can monitor your parents' home so that a shadow doesn't fall across their lawn without my knowledge." "But it comes with a price," she said, her voice steady. "The price is your trust," he replied softly. "You have to stop running from me to run from him. You have to decide if my world is a problem or a solution." Seraya looked at the photo of her brother one last time, then back at the man who had broken Darius's grip without a single shout. "Do it," she said. "Protect them. Do whatever you have to do to make sure he never looks at them again." Ji-Seon nodded, a sharp, professional gesture to Minjun, who immediately began speaking into a headset in rapid Korean. Seraya felt a strange, chilling relief wash over her. She had called the only man who could stop the monster, but in doing so, she had finally stepped across the threshold into the dragon's world, and she knew that the restraining order she had once relied on was now the least of Darius Vane's worries. The black sedan glided through the rain-slicked streets of the city, its tires whispering against the pavement as it approached the heavy iron gates of the park estate. Seraya sat in the backseat, her gaze fixed on the passing blur of high stone walls and security cameras that pivoted with silent, robotic precision. This wasn't just a home, it was a fortress, a world built on the foundation of unconventional success that her grandmother had so vaguely described. As the gates groaned open and then slammed shut behind them, Seraya felt the final thread of her old life snap. She was no longer a woman living in a studio apartment with a useless restraining order. She was a guest of the park organization, a variable in a high-stakes game she was only beginning to understand. Ji-Seon led her through the massive mahogany doors into an entry hall that smelled of expensive cedar and centuries of tradition. The architecture was a fusion of sharp, modern lines and traditional Korean elements, a physical representation of the man walking beside her. He moved through the house with a quiet authority, but Seraya noticed the way the household staff bowed low, their eyes averted, as if his presence were a sun too bright to look at directly. They were taken deep into the heart of the estate, past rooms filled with artifacts that looked like they belonged in a museum, until they reached a set of double doors guarded by two men who lacked the standard restaurant security uniforms. These were the men in black she had seen before, silent, lethal shadows who acknowledged Ji-Seon with a sharp, synchronized nod. Inside the private sunroom, the air was thick with the scent of jasmine tea and the weight of unspoken expectations. Seated at a low table was a woman whose elegance was so sharp it felt like a warning. Madame Park didn't look like a grandmother. She looked like a monarch who had seen empires rise and fall and had personally signed the paperwork for their demise. Her silver hair was pinned back with a jade comb that matched the bracelet on Seraya's wrist, and her eyes, dark and piercing, didn't waste a second on pleasantries. She was the real boss, the hidden hand that guided the family's legacy while Ji-Seon handled the world outside. "You are the woman my son has risked our public anonymity for," Madame Park said, her voice a low, melodic chime that carried the force of an order. She didn't offer a seat, she waited for Seraya to claim one. Seraya sat, keeping her back straight and her chin up, despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. She felt the woman's gaze traveling over her, measuring the width of her shoulders, the steadiness of her hands, and the fire still flickering in her eyes after months of Darius's attempts to extinguish it. It was a cold, clinical evaluation. Madame Park wasn't looking for a daughter-in-law. She was determining if Seraya was a liability who would break under pressure, or a queen who could stand beside a dragon without flinching. Marriage into this family, or even association with it, is not a romance from a book, Seraya Quinn, Madame Park continued, pouring tea with a hand that didn't tremble. It is an acceptance of responsibilities that would crush a lesser soul. Our enemies become yours. Our shadows become your son. She paused, her eyes locking onto Seraya's. My son tells me you are strong, but strength in the face of a bully like Darius Vane is common. I need to know if you have the spine to survive the world that created my son. I didn't come here seeking a rescue, Seraya replied, her voice steady enough to make Ji-Seon's posture relax just a fraction. I came because the world I was living in allowed a monster to hunt me with impunity. I am not looking for someone to hide behind. I am looking for the power to make sure the monster never looks back. Madame Park allowed a thin, razor-sharp smile to touch her lips, not a sign of warmth, but a sign of recognition. Good. Submission would have concerned me. We have no use for fragility here. She leaned forward, the jade in her hair catching the light. Darius Vane believes you are a prize to be won back. He does not yet understand that you have been claimed by a family that does not lose what it owns. But you must understand this. Once you step into this circle, the door does not open from the inside again. Ji-Seon finally spoke, his hand moving to cover Seraya's on the table, a gesture of partnership that seemed to challenge even his mother's authority. She is not a prize, mother. She is the choice I have made. The evaluation continued in the silence that followed, a heavy, atmospheric tension that Seraya realized was her new normal. She looked at the two of them, the dragon and the matriarch, and knew that the safe life she had dreamed of was gone. She had entered a world of absolute loyalty and devastating consequences, a place where protection was a promise and devotion was a blood oath. As Madame Park finally nodded, a silent dismissal that also felt like a blessing, Seraya felt the weight of the jade bracelet on her wrist grow heavier. She was no longer just surviving. She was being forged into something that could survive the parks. The rooftop terrace of the park estate offered a view of the city that felt like looking down at a map of a life Seraya no longer recognized. The wind up here was sharp, carrying the scent of rain and the distant, low hum of a world that didn't know the rules had changed. Seraya stood at the railing, her fingers tracing the smooth surface of her jade bracelet, her mind a storm of conflicting impulses. Behind her, the door to the elevator opened with a soft chime, and the familiar scent of cedar and cold air announced Ji-Seon's arrival before he even spoke. He didn't join her at the rail immediately. He gave her the space she had spent 8 months begging the world for, standing just far enough away that his presence felt like a choice, not a cage. "My mother has a way of making the future feel like a sentence," Ji-Seon said, his voice barely rising above the wind. He stepped forward now, his hands resting on the terrace railing, his sleeves rolled up just enough to hint at the dragon coiling beneath the fine fabric. "She isn't wrong about the weight of this family, but she is wrong if she made you feel like the door is already locked." Seraya turned to look at him, her hair whipping across her face in the dark. "She said I've been claimed, that the door doesn't open from the inside anymore." Ji-Seon finally looked at her, his expression unreadable beneath the shifting city lights. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a small, heavy envelope. He set it on the railing between them. "Inside is a new identity, a passport, a bank account with enough to ensure you never have to work again, and a ticket to a city where no one knows the name Seraya Quinn or Darius Vane." He didn't push it toward her. He left it as an offering. "If you take it, my men will escort you to the airport tonight. You will be a ghost, and the monster will never find you because the woman he is looking for will no longer exist." Seraya stared at the envelope. It was the blank check she had dreamed of for months, the ultimate escape. For 8 months, she had lived like a fugitive in her own skin, changing her routine, jumping at shadows, and praying for the day the world would simply forget her. "And what happens to Darius if I leave?" she whispered. "If you leave, he remains a problem for the authorities," Ji-Seon replied, his voice cooling to that clinical, terrifying edge. "I will no longer have a reason to interfere. He will likely spend his life looking for a memory until he burns himself out or find another victim to replace what he lost." He leaned in closer, his shadow falling over her like a protective shield. "But if you stay, if you choose to remain within this circle, I will neutralize him. Not legally, not through the machine of paper and ink that has already failed you. I will make sure he understands that you are untouchable. I will ensure he never draws another breath of the same air you do." The weight of the choice pressed down on her, heavier than the jade on her wrist. She thought about the life Ji-Seon was offering in that envelope, a life of hiding, of looking over her shoulder in a different city, of always being one accidental photo or one determined stalker away from a new nightmare. Then she thought about the man standing beside her, a predator who had chosen to be her sword. "Lamar, Darius used to make me feel small," she said, her voice growing stronger with every word. "He made me believe that fear was just the price of being a woman. He made me feel like I was property that needed to be kept." She looked at the envelope, then back at Ji-Seon. "If I take that ticket and run, I'm still letting him win. I'm still living a life defined by what he did to me." She picked up the envelope and, without breaking eye contact, dropped it back into his hand. "I'm tired of hiding, Ji-Seon. I'm tired of being a ghost in my own life." She stepped closer until she could feel the heat radiating from him, the scent of cedar and steel wrapping around her. "I don't want a ticket to another city. I want to stand my ground. I want to be the one who decides when the nightmare ends." Ji-Seon's hand closed around hers on the railing, his thumb brushing against the jade. "If you stay, Seraya, you are choosing a world that is dangerous in a different way. You are choosing a family that requires absolute loyalty." "I know," she replied, "but for the first time in 8 months, I don't feel like a victim. I feel like a partner." She looked at the dragon on his arm, no longer seeing a shackle, but a promise of a life where she was finally the one in control. "Neutralize him, whatever it takes. I want to be able to walk down the street without wondering if every passing car is a threat." Ji-Seon nodded, a slow, deliberate movement that felt like a sentence being signed. He reached out, his hand gentle as it cupped her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw where the memory of the slap still lingered. "Then it is done," he whispered. "You have chosen the shield, Seraya, and from this night forward, the dragon does not allow anyone to touch what belongs to his world." Seraya leaned into his touch, the adrenaline of the decision finally giving way to a strange, heavy sense of peace. She had traded her freedom for a different kind of power, and as she looked out over the city, she knew that the woman who had entered the restaurant 4 days ago was gone, replaced by someone who was finally ready to stop being the prey. The Metropolitan Art Gallery was a cavern of glass, white marble, and curated silence, but to Seraya, it felt like the belly of a waiting beast. As the honorary host of the evening's opening, she moved through the crowd in a floor-length gown of midnight silk, the jade bracelet on her wrist catching the sharp track lighting like a predator's eye. To the elite guests sipping champagne, she was a rising star in the consulting world, backed by the immense influence of the Park family. To the man watching her through the hidden lens of a security camera, she was the bait in a trap designed with clinical, lethal precision. Ji-Seon's voice was a low, steady vibration in her earpiece, a ghost of a sound that tethered her to reality whenever the room began to spin. "Breathe, Seraya. You are the center of this world tonight. He won't move until he thinks the stage is empty." She nodded almost imperceptibly, her fingers grazing the edge of a sculpture as she moved toward the rear of the gallery, away from the main cluster of politicians and socialites. Every face in the crowd was a potential threat. Yet she knew that half of the caterers and security guards were actually Ji-Seon's men, their hands never far from the concealed weapons beneath their tailored uniforms. The plan had been debated for hours in the war room of the Park estate. Ji-Seon had been reluctant to use her as the lure, his protective instinct warring with the strategic necessity of catching Darius in a final, undeniable act of criminal intent. But Seraya had insisted. She was tired of the restraining orders that Darius treated as trophies and the police reports that ended in dead ends. She wanted to be the one to pull the monster into the light so that Ji-Seon could finally put him down. As the clock struck 10, the main lights dimmed for a scheduled cinematic presentation, plunging the gallery into a wash of deep blues and flickering shadows. Seraya slipped into the private viewing room at the back of the hall, a space designed for high-value collectors, and closed the door behind her. The silence here was absolute, heavy with the scent of oil paint and the metallic tang of adrenaline. "He's in the service corridor," Ji-Seon's voice murmured, the calm in his tone now replaced by a razor-sharp focus. 2 minutes, stay near the window." The door didn't creak when it opened. It simply breathed. Seraya didn't turn around immediately, her gaze fixed on her own reflection in the darkened window. She saw him before she felt him, a shadow that didn't belong, a figure that looked frayed and diminished compared to the muscular chaos of the man she had once feared. Darius looked unwashed, his eyes bloodshot and wide with a desperate, wild triumph. He had bypassed the security gap Ji-Seon had intentionally left for him, believing he had finally outsmarted the rich boyfriend, and found his way back to the woman he considered his own. "Finally," Darius whispered, the sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. "No bodyguards, no cameras, just us, Seraya." Seraya turned slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her voice remained steady. "You shouldn't have come here, Darius. You've already lost everything. Why can't you just let me go?" "Let you go," he laughed, a jagged, broken sound that echoed off the marble. He stepped into the circle of light, his hand reaching out as if to reclaim a lost possession. "You ruined me. You took my job, my pride, my dignity. You think you can just move into a palace and forget where you came from? You're mine, Seraya. You've always been mine." His hand shot out, his fingers bruising her arm as he yanked her toward him, his face inches from hers. The smell of cheap liquor and old rage filled her senses, a familiar nightmare returned to the light. But this time, Seraya didn't scream. She didn't beg. She looked past him at the shadow moving silently across the far wall. "I'm not yours, Darius," she said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly cold register. "I'm the last mistake you'll ever make." The door behind Darius didn't just open. It exploded inward with a force that made the glass partitions rattle. Park Ji-Seon entered with the same clinical, predatory grace he had shown at the restaurant. But tonight, there was no tuxedo to hide the dragon. He moved with a speed that defied the human eye, his hand catching Darius's wrist and applying a pressure that forced a guttural howl of pain from the man's throat. Darius spun, still trying to hold onto Seraya's arm, but he was fighting a force of nature. Ji-Seon's men, the men in black who had been part of the shadows, stepped into the room from every entrance, their weapons drawn and focused with surgical precision. The gallery was no longer an art space. It had become a park-owned slaughterhouse, and Darius Vane was the only one who didn't know the sentence had already been passed. "You don't touch her," Ji-Seon said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that made the air feel like it was vibrating. He didn't look at Seraya. His eyes were fixed on Darius, who was now pinned to the floor, his face pressed against the cold marble. "You don't look at her. You don't even breathe the air she inhabits." Seraya stood by the window, her chest heaving, her eyes fixed on the man who had just saved her for the final time. She watched as the men in suits hauled Darius upright, his bravado replaced by a whimpering, empty defeat. This was the end of the line for the bully who had hunted her for 8 months. He was walking out of this gallery and into a world where the Park family's influence ensured he would never be seen or heard from again. As Ji-Seon turned to her, the dragon on his arm finally visible in the harsh light, Seraya realized that the trap hadn't just caught a monster, it had finally set her free. The fluorescent lights of the holding area hummed with a sterile, buzzing indifference, a stark contrast to the velvet shadows of the Park estate. Seraya walked down the narrow corridor, her heels clicking against the linoleum with a steady, rhythmic finality. Ji-Seon walked a half-step behind her, a silent wall of tailored wool and lethal intent, his presence ensuring that even the air in this government building obeyed his rules. At the end of the hall, behind a heavy reinforced door, sat the remains of the man who had haunted her dreams for 8 months. When the heavy steel latch turned, the sound was like a gavel striking stone. Inside, Darius Vane sat slumped at a metal table, his hands cuffed to a central bolt. The man who had loomed so large in her mind, the muscular chaos of her nightmares, looked small in the harsh, unforgiving glare of the room. His clothes were torn from the scuffle at the gallery, and his face was a map of swelling bruises and empty, hollow defeat. He didn't look up when they entered. He seemed to be staring at a point on the table that only he could see. Ji-Seon didn't sit. He moved to the corner of the room, folding his arms, his dark eyes fixed on Darius with a clinical, predatory watchfulness. He had promised Seraya this moment, the chance to deliver the final word before the Park organization's influence ensured that Darius Vane was removed permanently from her reality. Seraya pulled out the heavy metal chair across from Darius, the screech of it against the floor making him flinch. She sat down, her back straight, her hands resting calmly on the table. She wasn't shaking. The cold, liquid fear that had defined her life for nearly a year had finally evaporated, replaced by a strange, heavy sense of iron. "Look at me, Darius," she said, her voice low and terrifyingly steady. He slowly lifted his head. His eyes were bloodshot, the wild rage of the gallery replaced by a dull, flickering recognition. "You think you're special now," he rasped, his voice a jagged shadow of its former self. "You think because you're sleeping with a monster that you've won? You don't even know what he is, Seraya. He's worse than I ever was." "I know exactly who he is," Seraya replied, her gaze never wavering. "He's the man who showed me the difference between a bully and a king. He's the man who taught me that real power doesn't need to shout, and real protection doesn't come with a price of blood and bruises." She leaned forward, her face inches from the man who had once tried to claim her as property. "For 8 months, you made me believe that I was small. You made me believe that I was a victim whose only purpose was to reflect your anger. You thought you could throw wine on me, slap me in public, and hunt my family until I crawled back to you." Darius tried to sneer, but the expression collapsed into a pathetic twitch. "I loved you," he whispered, a final, desperate lie. "That wasn't love, Darius. That was a cage," Seraya corrected, her voice cutting through his words like a blade. "You taught me to be afraid of my own shadow, but in doing so, you forced me to find a light you couldn't extinguish. You didn't ruin me. You just cleared the way for the woman I was always supposed to be." She stood up, the movement slow and deliberate. She reached into her purse and pulled out the folded, tattered copy of the restraining order she had carried for months. She placed it on the table in front of him. "I don't need this anymore," she said. "Because after today, you don't exist in my world. You don't get a single second of my thoughts. You don't get a single breath in my presence. You are a memory I have chosen to delete." Darius lunged forward, his cuffs rattling violently against the table bolt, but Ji-Seon was there in an instant. He didn't strike. He simply placed a hand on Darius's shoulder and applied a pressure that made the man's knees buckle under the table. The silence that Ji-Seon maintained was more terrifying than any threat Darius could scream. "We're done," Seraya said, turning toward the door. "This isn't over, Seraya," Darius screamed as they walked away, his voice echoing down the sterile hallway. "I'll find you, I'll always find you." But his voice didn't make her flinch. It didn't make her heart race. It was just noise, the sound of a dying fire in a room made of stone. As they stepped back into the night air, Ji-Seon took her hand, his palm warm and steady. "He's gone, Seraya," Ji-Seon whispered, his eyes searching hers for any sign of the old fear. "I know," she replied, looking up at the city skyline. "And this time I believe it." She felt the jade bracelet on her wrist, no longer a weight, but a seal. The transformation was complete. The victim had delivered the final sentence, and as the black sedan pulled away from the station, Seraya Quinn didn't look back. The bully had been replaced by a king, and she was finally ready to stop being the one who was saved and start being the one who reigned. The floor-to-ceiling glass of the penthouse, suite, offered a view of the city that no longer felt like a labyrinth of hiding places, but like a kingdom laid out in a grid of golden light. A year had passed since the red wine had stained her dress, and the crack of a slap had echoed through a restaurant. Yet the woman standing in the high-rise was unrecognizable from the one who had sat trembling across from Park Ji-Seon. Seraya Quinn leaned against the cool glass, her silhouette reflected back as a sharp, elegant line of midnight silk. She was no longer a victim living in 800 square feet of anxiety. She was a woman who occupied the sky. The jade bracelet on her right wrist had been joined by a second ring, a band of polished gold and deep green stone that marked her as family, a promise of devotion that had been fulfilled through a year of steady, unwavering protection. On her left hand, a flawless diamond caught the city's glimmer, a testament to the moment Ji-Seon had knelt not out of obligation, but out of a choice that was absolute. She remembered the weight of her old life, the way her shoulders used to hunch as if expecting a blow, and she marveled at how upright she stood now. The overwhelming silence that used to haunt her apartment was gone, replaced by the quiet, hummed efficiency of a life governed by the park organization. Below her, the black sedans that had once seemed like omens were now her honor guard. Minjun and the others were no longer shadows she feared, but familiar presences who treated her with a deference that went beyond professional duty. They didn't just protect her, they respected the power she had cultivated. Over the last 12 months, Seraya had done more than just hide behind the dragon. She had learned to breathe fire beside him. She had launched her own consulting firm from a building Ji-Seon had gifted her, using the same strategic mind that had survived Darius to navigate the cutthroat world of international business. Darius Vane was a name she hadn't spoken in months, a ghost exorcised by a legal system that had finally found its teeth once Ji-Seon's men provided the unconventional evidence required to keep him behind bars indefinitely. The nightmares had faded, replaced by the reality of a man who asked about her dreams and listened to her family's stories with a sincerity that never wavered. She had watched Ji-Seon balance the darkness of his roots with the light of the future they were building together, realizing that his strength was never meant to diminish hers, but to provide the soil in which she could finally grow. A soft chime announced the opening of the private elevator, and the familiar scent of cedar and cold night air filled the room. She didn't turn around, knowing exactly where he would be. Ji-Seon approached her with that same predatory grace, but as he reached her, the lethal edge was entirely absent. He stepped behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, his chin resting gently on her shoulder. "You're thinking about that night," he murmured, his voice a low vibration against her skin. "I was thinking about the woman I used to be," Seraya replied, leaning back into his heat. "The one who thought safety was a miracle I'd never receive." Ji-Seon turned her in his arms, his eyes searching hers with a pride that was visible even in the dim light. "You were never just a miracle, Seraya. You were a choice I'd make 1,000 times over." He reached up, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw where the bruise had long since vanished, replaced by a glow of health and certainty. "Any regrets?" "None," she whispered, her voice echoing the annual tradition they had established. "Because I'm not just the girl who was slapped anymore. I'm the woman who survived, the woman who chose, and the woman who thrives." They had built an extraordinary life from the broken pieces of a restaurant floor. Her family was safe, her brother was thriving, and her grandmother still smiled knowingly whenever they visited for Sunday dinner. Seraya had learned that protection without possession was the greatest gift a man like Ji-Seon could offer. She had accepted his world, the shadows, the territory, and the fierce loyalty, and in return she had found a throne. As they stood together overlooking the city, the dragon and his queen, Seraya realized that the slap hadn't been the end of her story. It had been the inciting incident for a transformation she never could have imagined. She had traded a life of fear for a life of protected power, and as Ji-Seon kissed her under the light of the stars, she knew she would never settle for anything less than being cherished. The world below continued its frantic, chaotic dance, but up here, in the silence of the high-rise, Seraya Quinn was finally and completely home.